want you to imagine something. All right, just stay with me. I want you to imagine something. I want you to imagine that you are a tunneler. You're in a battle and you're a tunneler. Now, what does a tunneler do? Well, you can probably figure it out, but you have a shovel, pick, some tools. You and your friends have to dig a hole down. You dig that hole down, and then once you're way deep under the ground, you begin with your shovels and your buckets and your picks. There's no backhoe down there. There's no nothing. You begin to dig your way towards the enemy lines, all right? Now, understand something. You live pretty much in the dark every day, working dark over and over again, dirt, hauling it in and out, shoveling and picking and shoveling and picking, all right? And so this is your life day after day after day. And eventually, after about a week of this, you feel like maybe you hear something ahead, but that doesn't make sense because it's all just dirt under there, right? It's all just dirt ahead of you. You're digging out the dirt. You're bringing it out the back of the tunnel. But the thing you hear gets louder and louder and louder throughout the day. Keep in mind, your only light down here is a little lamp, maybe a little old school flashlight. It's very, very dark. It's all shadows, things like that. And that afternoon, not that you care what time of day it is, because it's always pretty much pitch black where you are, something happens. You see your buddy, it was his turn up there at the dirt wall, and he took one more swing with the pickaxe, and he broke through. Broke through into what? He broke through into the tunnel the enemy was digging, coming back your way. And now, you and your two buddies are going to have a pick, dagger, brass knuckle, hand-to-hand combat fight to the death with the three Germans you just ran into down there in the pitch black. At one point in time, of course, the lantern gets kicked over and gone. So when I say pitch black, I mean you don't even know who you're punching and stabbing. Sound scary? That's World War I. World War I contains more individual horrors when you read combat stories than you can ever imagine. And I have always found this conflict to be so horrifying because of the conditions the man on the ground lived in. And that's just one story, the tunnelers. The tunnelers were a famous part of World War I. You, of course, probably know World War I for the trenches. If you were to ask most people what they know about World War I, they would know the trenches. Well, why were there so many trenches in World War I? All these trenches, we're in a trench and you're in a trench. Why all these trenches? Because World War I was the war where artillery became a really big deal. All of a sudden, because of technology, because of industry, because of rifling and other things, all of a sudden mankind now possessed guns that could fire highly explosive rounds 20 miles away. And you manufacture a bunch of those rounds and you simply start lobbing them. There's a guy, Ernst Younger, I believe is his name. He wrote a book, Storm of Steel. He was in World War I. And he described, but it was like many times in that book, to be under an artillery barrage, to be under attack by artillery. The air around you full of jagged hot steel, tearing people apart. That's why you had to stay in a trench. Otherwise, you would die. It's so terrible. And one of the things that hits me most about how terrible, truly, truly terrible World War I was this part of it. The men who went off to World War I in the beginning, they didn't know that's what they were getting into. You know, if I sign up today to go off to war, I'm not going to do that. I'm too old. I'm 42 now. No more war for me. But if I was to sign up today to go off to war, to go fight in Iran or something like that, I would have a pretty good idea of what combat would look like. I've been in combat in the last 20 years. I see what the advances have been. Obviously, things have changed, drones and whatnot, but I would have a pretty good idea of what combat would look like. But the young men who signed up to go off to war for Germany or France or Britain, America eventually, they didn't have any idea what they were getting into because combat had always been something different. It wasn't machine guns mowing down 50 men in half a second. It wasn't artillery rounds that could take out your entire platoon with one shot from 20 miles away. That wasn't what combat ever was. It's not that combat was wonderful. I'm not going to make that point, but it wasn't that. You show up and you think it's going to be cavalry charges and swords and we'll do this in an afternoon and then we'll go have a picnic, and you find yourself in a trench using your buddy's head to fill a sandbag to protect you from the next artillery barrage. That's the kind of thing that happened in World War I. How does the mind continue to work after that? And speaking of the mind, I keep bringing up artillery because I always come back to this. Everybody who's been through one says there's nothing in the world more terrifying than being in the middle of an artillery barrage. I want you to picture this. I want you to picture an entire town's worth of men. Remember, a lot of the enlistment, a lot of the military stuff was done differently back then. Let's say if you were Britain, you wouldn't just recruit a bunch of boys, a bunch of young men, 17, 18-year-olds. You would go to a specific town, a tiny village somewhere, and you would gather all those boys up, and you would keep them together. There are arguments about the ways of thinking, whether it's correct or not, but the idea behind it was you would fight better, you would last longer, you would be a better soldier if you were in the military with the men you knew, with the men you grew up around. So you would go off to boot camp and train with them, and then you would be in the same unit, and you would go off to fight in World War I. So picture this, an entire village worth of young men, towns worth of young men, having lunch somewhere. An artillery round lands in the midst of them. And that day, one town lost all of its young men in one day. They're all gone. Every mother, every wife, every sister, every father in that town getting that knock on the door at the same time, the same day. Everyone in town gets a visit and says, your son's gone. Your husband's gone. There are no more young men in your town. That was World War I. People do not understand how truly horrific this conflict was because of World War II. It's not that people are stupid. World War II came along after, and of course overshadowed World War I, the loss of life and the technology and the atom bomb and the Nazis and the Japanese. There was so much of World War II overshadowed World War I that we forget that World War I, not World War II, World War I, in my opinion, is really when so much of the world changed. And so many changes we still see today, they began in World War I. World War I, carnage unimaginable. Men drowning in mud. Imagine slowly over the course of 2 days drowning in mud. That was World War I. Battles like Verdun, Passchendaele, the Somme, but we don't discuss this war enough. And then the American contributions at the end when Americans came in, and you should be very proud, if you're an American watching this, you should be very proud of your country and its contributions to World War I, because America was truly, truly great in that war. And our men, our boys, were so insanely brave. The Europeans who'd been fighting for years all remarked on how brave, oftentimes stupid brave, but how brave the Americans were. When we got there, rifles in hand, we were there to fight. We have so many guests on our show tonight to just dive into this stuff. What was all this technology, the advances? Why was it so terrible? Why didn't the leaders, the generals, the politicians, why didn't they look at all this carnage and stop? That's the question I probably had the most. Every World War I book I read, every documentary I watch on it, I always sit and think to myself, why did nobody stop this? Somebody could have stopped this. Somebody should have stopped this. You weren't dealing with the Nazi regime or something like that. None of that was around. Why did no one step in and stop this while so many men were dying? We're going to talk about all this stuff tonight on our wonderful World War I history special. You ready for that? Good. We'll do it. World War I, as you know, I absolutely adore it, but most people don't know much about it, and they don't understand why it even started. How did we get into it at all? Why did we get into it at all? Let's bring in Mark Moyer. He is the chair of military history at Hillsdale College. Gosh, that's a sweet position. I bet he knows all kinds of cool stuff. Mark, okay, lay this out for the dummies among us, like me. Set the scene for us. What was going on in the world that could even get the world into such a horrible conflict that like the world had never seen before? What was the world like?
Well, the world in 1914, when the war starts, is, a lot of people think, a pretty peaceful, modern place. A lot of people think we have outgrown war. We've become smarter, better people. And but at the same time, you've got different European countries are hoping to outwit their enemies in the event of war. So they start arming after the murder of Archduke Ferdinand in 1914. And so it's a race to see who can arm first and then win first. And everybody at the beginning thinks this is going to be a quick war. There had been a big war between France and Germany in 1871, and it was quite quick. And nobody really has any idea of what is going to happen ultimately. And the United States will seek to stay out of it, but it bogs down into attrition warfare in both the Western fronts and the Eastern fronts. Horrendous casualties will eventually produce great disillusionment throughout Europe, but the U.S. will try to stay out of it and does until 1917.
Franz Ferdinand, okay, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. A lot of people know the name. They understand that something happened. He died to start the war, but why would the death of some dude who wasn't even the big cheese in Austria-Hungary somehow turn into millions of people dying? How does that even happen?
Yes, well, you have these alliances among the British, among the European powers, and it's a Serb nationalist who kills Archduke Ferdinand. The Russians sympathize with the Serbs. The Russians are allied with the French and the British. The Germans and Austrians are allied against them. And but it is a great question. Again, I think you can only fathom it by assuming that everyone thought this was going to be a short war. And there was in Europe at that time a certain respect, even adoration in some cases for military service, but it was the kind of thing where you would, go take part in war for a few weeks and then go home. It was nothing like the horrific trench warfare that we ultimately saw in Europe.
Mark, how did trench warfare come to be? Because it's not something, obviously there had been trenches in the past, I realize that, but this horrible, I have a trench, you have a trench, let's just shoot each other in the face for a while, this kind of warfare is not something the world had seen before, so why did it come now?
Well, the primary reason is the advent of the machine gun. The machine gun gives a great advantage to the defense. And so if you're trying to move quickly, there's numerous attempts by both sides to try to penetrate each other's lines, but the machine gun takes such a horrific toll, and then you also have improved artillery, and between those things, it makes it extremely difficult to try to advance. And even if you are able to advance, there's going to be secondary and tertiary trench lines behind you, and that's will continue for most of the war. And it's actually interesting to see how it compares with Ukraine today, where we have other new technologies that will make it very difficult to advance. World War II, you have the tank, which shifts the balance again a bit more towards the offensive, but clearly here, the defensive position is far superior to the offensive.
What's the similarity with Ukraine today?
In terms of the defense being stronger, front lines not shifting much, because whenever you try to make a significant forward movement, thanks in part to drones, because drones can now see vehicles that are moving and fire can be brought at them very quickly. So both sides have tried to launch these significant offensives, but both have been stopped. And so you do have, again, troops sort of undercover, relying on artillery, and the front lines not moving much, but still heavy casualties on both sides.
Mark, why did it take America so long to get into World War I? Americans today are used to getting involved in every war, everywhere, all the time, but it was a very different country back then, wasn't it?
It was in some senses, though it's worth thinking about Woodrow Wilson himself. He wasn't really representative of the people, I think, but even before World War I, you see him intervening in Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and Mexico, and he's doing this for primarily what he thinks are idealistic reasons, that these countries are poorly governed and therefore they need our help. And although in each case, it turns out to be a lot more difficult, but he sends troops into all those countries before World War I. And then in the case of World War I, the country itself is pretty reluctant, but Wilson initially will promise them that he's not going to get in. And in fact, in the 1916 election, he specifically says, I'm the guy who kept you out of war. And so when he declares war just a few months later, a lot of people will be crying foul that he misled them about what he was going to be doing.
How did he mislead them? Did he mislead them?
Yes, well, he gave people the impression that the country was not going to go into war. And in 1916, there's increases in defense spending for both the Navy and the Army, but Wilson assures people that these armaments are going to be used strictly to defend the American homeland, not for some kind of offensive campaign. And he also doesn't, I think, come clean with the people in terms of the maritime commerce situation, which is central to the U.S. involvement, because Wilson, on the one hand, talks of maintaining freedom of the seas, but the British have actually denied us access to the ports of the Central Powers, which is something a lot of Wilson's opponents will point out repeatedly, that the British have actually violated our rights, our maritime rights, as much as the Germans. But the Germans, end up resorting to submarine warfare ultimately, which will help convince Wilson and others that it's time for war. But he certainly, I think in hindsight, can be faulted for not being straight with the American people.
Obviously, something got screwed up with the, quote, peace agreement at the end of World War I, the whole Treaty of Versailles leading directly to World War II and whatnot. Did we have a hand in that? Or how, I guess I should say, how big of a hand did we have in the horrible peace deal we struck at the end of this thing?
We did have a significant hand, although we could have had a bigger hand had we been able to push our army into Germany. And this is one of the things that happens at the end of the war. As Germany is about to capitulate, the Americans want to push into Germany because Germany's still holding its own national territory. And the Americans think this will be a way to increase our diplomatic leverage. But the British and the French object. And one of the disturbing problems is that the British and the French are repeatedly playing the United States and telling us that they're going to do one thing and then they do another. For example, Wilson says we're going to allow self-determination for all these colonies, but and we're going to have open treaty agreements. But the French and the British behind our backs are negotiating their own deals to maintain their colonial empires. And Wilson has this fairly benign view of what's going to happen with Germany, but he allows the French and the British to impose these stiff reparations, to take territory from the Germans. And these are things that Adolf Hitler will then exploit in the 1930s, when he'll say, well, Germany got stabbed in the back. We had to give up all this population, and we had to give up our military. And so it really sets the conditions for World War II.
Mark, tell us about your book real quick.
The latest book I have is about my time in the Trump administration. I am primarily a military historian. I've written a lot about the Vietnam War especially, but I also served in the Trump administration. And this book is coming out soon, and it's about my experiences dealing with corrupt bureaucrats. I reported some people, including one of my subordinates or several of my subordinates, for corrupt criminal conflict of interest. And then the government, not the whole government, but friends of these individuals came after me and falsely accused me of publishing classified information, and they've been stalling ever since. So the book talks about that, and then it looks more broadly on how the Trump administration, first time around, was subverted in many cases. And part of it, too, I blame on some of the political appointees who were not chosen correctly. So I'm hoping this time around, if Trump wins re-election, that they will be more careful. And I think there's already efforts underway to achieve that.
I hope so. Mark, thank you, sir. I appreciate it very much. All right. Let's talk to a British World War I historian. Be anxious to get that perspective. Next. You know, people ask you what you wanted to be when you were growing up. And you know, I have the nerdiest answer for that ever. I wanted to be a historian, specifically some kind of war historian. I was never smart enough to pull that off, so now I do TV. But now we have one, at least on the show, from across the pond to talk about some World War I stuff. I'm just going to geek out with Paul about this. Joining me now, World War historian. Is that not freaking cool? Paul Reed. He's also the host of the Old Frontline podcast, which I would recommend. Paul, you have the coolest gig in the world. Before we get into World War I, is it not just great that you just get to study these wars and concepts and economies? I would just nerd out all day.
I'm very, very lucky, and thanks for having me on, Jesse. I've spent a lifetime living kind of in the shadow of giants, really, men and women who served in two great conflicts, and been inspired, really, by the lessons that you kind of learn from those people.
Yeah, no doubt about it. All right, everybody knows about World War II. Everybody knows about World War II. Not that that's small. It's the largest human event in history. I realize that. But World War I think probably because of World War II, is really forgotten about. You bring up even major battles today, Verdun. You tell someone about Verdun or the Somme, although they probably know about the Somme where you are. Most people don't really understand these things. What is it that people don't get the most about World War I?
I think they've got a very fixed idea of what they think the war is about, and it changed with every year of the war, from the kind of war that everyone thought they were going to fight in 1914, which was a war of movement in the open, to, in the image you kind of see there, which is from the Battle of the Somme, to trench warfare by the first winter. And that trench warfare remained pretty much deadlocked along what became known as the Western Front until the great battles of 1918 broke it. And the American involvement of that in 1918 with the American Expeditionary Force is probably one of the most forgotten aspects of it. I mean, last week I stood on a hillside in the Meuse-Argonne where there are 14,000 graves of American soldiers who died in the last 6 weeks of the war. And that cemetery only has a handful of American visitors every year. And I'm sure many of the people who watch your show will walk by World War I monuments in their towns and their cities every day, won't have any kind of idea of America's connection to it that they made.
Yeah. Paul, can you talk about the very beginning of it? Because you mentioned the trench warfare, the shift to trench warfare. And whenever I read a book on it, I'm always struck by how war was so different prior to World War I, and how it almost made it uniquely terrible in my mind for the men who were in the trenches, because they never saw themselves as rotting in a trench for 6 months, waking up with rats on their chest. They wanted to be on a horse with a saber in their hands, charging like Grandpa used to do. And it was just so different than war had ever been fought before.
Absolutely. And many of these nations went to war in 1914 thinking they would refight the Battle of Waterloo or some great epic from the past. But industry and industrial might and power had enabled the creation of artillery and the shells and the machine guns and everything else. And barbed wire, an American invention that enabled the containment of cattle, but not just cattle, the containment of men. And all these kind of things came together in 1914 to create a situation where trench warfare on a big scale, 450 miles of what became the Western Front, was possible. And like you say, men went from thinking they were going to stand in open fields. French officers had white gloves that they put on when they went into battle in 1914 with swords and so on. And then a few months later, they are literally in ditches full of water with rats and bodies rotting in no man's land, men hanging on the wire, and kind of everything that we think of when we think of trench warfare. So a generation really that had grown up probably in a kind of golden age of many of those countries that ended up living in these kind of subhuman conditions in the trenches of the First World War, and the generals commanding them spending much of the 4 years trying to find out ways to end that kind of warfare.
Paul, can you talk a little bit more, expand just a little bit on the barbed wire concept of this? Because I've always found this to be fascinating. It seems like such a small thing, right? You and I talk about a machine gun or artillery, as you just pointed out. They get you from 25 miles away. Now, that makes sense how that would change warfare. Barbed wire? It's for cattle and horses. Why would barbed wire change anything?
Well, that's a good question. And if you think about it, if you're going to end up in what is essentially a huge siege war, you want to stop the enemy from getting into your positions. In the past, that would have been castle walls with huge escarpments. Now it's trenches dug in fields. And barbed wire suddenly takes on a much greater importance in a way that it hadn't before. And you can use coils of barbed wire strung on wooden posts. Eventually they had metal posts to do it with, to stop your enemy from getting into your trenches, or create kill zones. So you have gaps in that barbed wire so that the enemy troops move towards those gaps. You train your weapons on them and you cause the maximum number of casualties. So that kind of innocent bit of metal with a few barbs on it, which got increasingly sophisticated, and the barbs got bigger and bigger and closer together and nastier, took on a much more important role in those 4 years of trench warfare in the Great War.
Paul, Americans love, obviously everybody of every nation loves to focus on their own nation's role in it, and you pointed out America's, and I appreciate that. But a lot of people, especially in this country, do not really understand the sacrifice Britain made in that war. Specifically, I mean, throughout the war, but the Somme. The Somme was so uniquely terrible. I talk about it on my radio show whenever the World War I comes up, that Americans, I don't know that we've ever had a battle fought on foreign soil that wounded us as a nation the way the Somme wounded Britain. And maybe I'm out of line with that, but you wrote a book called Walking the Somme. Talk about it.
Well, I mean, the Battle of the Somme has kind of occupied my life for most of my life. I was lucky to interview hundreds of Great War veterans who served in the Battle of the Somme. And for them, they kind of went into that battle, which was in the summer of 1916. The first day of that battle was on a perfect summer's day where the sky was blue, there were clouds above, and it could have been a walk in the park. That's what they were told it would be. But at 0 hour, they moved out into no man's land, and all those kind of factors of trench warfare came together in that one moment, with barbed wire, deep trenches, dugouts, German machine guns, artillery, and 57,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers became casualties in a single day, of which 20,000 were men killed in action. And most of those casualties were in the first 30 minutes of the battle, as these men moved out of their trenches into no man's land and just got scythed down by machine gun fire. I mean, one of the guys that I interviewed, he grew up in a little town in northern Britain, and he watched people that he'd gone to school with, that he played football with before the war, that he worked with, that he drank in pubs with. You know, they were from an identifiable local tiny community, and they all went into battle, and the whole town was just thrown into mourning as a consequence of this, and was never really the same again. The Somme really kind of ended part of Britain, and the sacrifice on the Somme, 450,000 British and Commonwealth casualties, of which 150,000 were killed. It's something that still resonates, I think, through British society to this day. And when you go there, I mean, I lived there for many years, the evidence of war is all around: crumbling trenches, barbed wire pickets that held the barbed wire up, and bunkers and things like that. But even in the fields, you can find cartridges and shrapnel balls. And when the plows ploughed deep, the remains of soldiers, because so many were missing and disappeared into the mud, and in some cases more than 100 years later are still being found.
God, have mercy. Why so much carnage in 1916? And I asked the question for this reason, for those who don't understand. Obviously, it kicked off in 1914. All right, it's a new kind of warfare. We have machine guns, we have artillery, we have barbed wire. 1915 on the Western Front, probably the worst place to be in the history of the world. But by 1916, as a general, you should understand that, right? You don't just mass up the men and charge the machine gun nest. Shouldn't they have understood that?
I think that they saw the way technology had changed all their lives since the very beginnings of their lives, with Britain in the 19th century, with industry and so on. And they saw that in the First World War with the advent of new weapons. The tank arrived during the Battle of the Somme, for example. And they believed in the ability of that industry and that power and that change in technology to win the battles. But it wasn't possible when the enemy was dug in so deeply. It was a fundamental misunderstanding of what that kind of weaponry could do. And so when you were chancing the entire success based on the number of shells fired, it wasn't, I mean, it's often been described as devil's arithmetic, the First World War, where you kind of send men over into battle, and by the end of the war, you'll have X amount left and the enemy will have Y, and hopefully your X amount will be more than them. But on the first day of the Somme, it proved that firepower alone cannot win battles, that you've got to kind of be far more intelligent about the way you fight that war. And I think in the next 2 years, up to the point that America really enters the foray on the Western Front with battles like the Versailles, you see a completely different change in the way armies fight wars, and you see more modern battles with more kind of modern techniques and tactics being employed. 1918 sees the first use of armoured personnel carriers, converted tanks. You've got battles with hundreds of tanks going into battle, aircraft in the sky, drowning out the noise of those tanks as they advanced. Barrages that were just unbelievable. I mean, the American barrage in the Versailles was 3 hours long, and more shells were fired in that bombardment of 3 hours than in the entire Civil War. And I think it cost something like $1 million an hour to kind of fire the shells that were there. It was a staggering kind of figure. The soldiers, the veterans, called it the $1 million barrage. So it wasn't just about dropping shells on the enemy. You had to give your men a chance to get across no man's land, survive that attack, and capture enemy ground. And it took all those years and all those casualties to really figure that out. And I'm sure, 100 years from now, the equivalent of us a century on will be discussing exactly the same kind of things as to whether all that was worth it.
Man, that is so sadly true. Paul, thank you, sir. I could keep you for an hour and geek out with you, but I won't do that to you. I appreciate it very much. Fascinating war, isn't it? It's awful, but fascinating. I can't wait to talk to Daryl Cooper about that. He always has a unique perspective. Daryl Cooper comes up next. I'll be honest with you, to be frank, with all due respect to everyone else, and even my monologue, this is the part of the show I'm looking most forward to whenever I discuss anything culturally or historically. Daryl Cooper's my favorite. He just is. He's the host of the Martyr Made podcast. He always has a different perspective, an interesting perspective on things. Daryl, one of the things that's fascinating, and when I say fascinating, I generally mean horrifying, but about World War I is how technology advanced so fast and how that is what got us so much carnage like the world had never seen before. We're used to things like this today, but talk about the difference technologically in World War I versus the wars that came before it and what it meant for people.
Well, if you think about it, the last time that European powers had been engaged in a prolonged, serious conflict against each other was probably the Crimean War of the 1850s. That was, 60 years before World War I kicked off. And as you say, things had completely transformed. I mean, you talk about the introduction of just, even something like barbed wire, which proved to be such a massive factor on the World War I battlefield. That wasn't invented until 1867. And, so you have a prime example of a war where the technology had developed dramatically since that last major conflict. But because they hadn't been engaged in a conflict like that in a long time, the tactics had not adjusted and the leadership mentality had not adjusted to the new reality. And so, not one of the powers that got involved in 1914 expected the war to last very long. They all had unrealistic expectations of how the war was going to go and how their forces were going to handle the war. And this affected their reasoning when deciding whether to go to war. Just as the memory of the Great War's carnage affected the reasoning of many Allied leaders when they let Hitler's early aggression pass for fear of another conflagration. And as you know, real quick, I know we're talking about World War I, but something that you said is exactly true. Is technological advancement had advanced back then. Like you said, we're used to it now. It seems like if we have a war every 10 years, everything changes. I don't know how much how you would have liked fighting in the cities of Iraq with all the drone technology and stuff we're seeing in Ukraine now. And that's a good example of Russia thinking about the last war, and we're going to go in there against Ukraine and do our thing. But things have changed, and they found that out the hard way.
Daryl, I want to talk about this part of it because you're the perfect person to talk about this with. They found it out the hard way. This is one of the things that I find so maddening and sad about World War I. We hear all the time, anyone who's even vaguely familiar with World War I, is the technology advanced and the tactics didn't change, right? So they massed up men and charge over the wall, guys, and then a whole platoon gets wiped out, which usually translates into a whole town's worth of young men in Britain being wiped out. But Daryl, why didn't the tactics change? And I guess I should say, why did it take so long for them to change? When you're whoever, a battalion commander, anybody, and you order 50 men over the side and all 50 get mowed down in 5 seconds, how isn't that the moment where all tactics change? But it took so many lives for adjustments to be made, and I have never wrapped my mind around why it took so long to adjust.
That's a good question. A lot of people have written about it. You can talk about sort of intransigence and arrogance of the leaders who were involved, who didn't want to admit that everything they knew was outdated. If you look at all the major powers, all of them, even Germany, which had probably the most respected general staff in Europe at the time, in the first year of the war, just huge swaths of all their generals got fired, and successful battle commanders, colonels, and one stars and stuff got promoted because you had a bunch of people who had made flag officer in peacetime, and you didn't know how they were going to react under the circumstances. And I think there's a kind of institutional inertia that is very hard to overcome when you're talking about a bureaucratic society. You think about us, the American military today is probably the best learning organization in terms of major militaries around the world that exists. All the things we have in place to integrate lessons learned and so forth. We went into Iraq in March of 2003, and it really wasn't until maybe like Ramadi in 2006, maybe a little before that, before we sort of really admitted that we were in a different war than the one we thought we were getting into, and made major adjustments to our tactics to deal with, an actual insurgency. And that's us, When you talk about World War I, the powers are much more totally involved than we ever were in Iraq, in the sense of, I think people were caught up in it in a way that felt like they were being pulled along. And you see this like in Churchill's history of the war. He talks about how in 1914 was awful and terrible. 1915, he says, was the year when it stopped being about men and human decisions and forces took over. And that's an interesting kind of Churchillian way to put that. And I think that's how a lot of people felt at the time. I mentioned barbed wire earlier, 1867, massive role in the battlefield there. But machine guns, the perfection of long-range artillery, standard infantry rifles that made a proficient soldier deadly at 500 yards. All that added up to giving a huge advantage to the defense as opposed to the offense, and making things just immeasurably difficult for the offense trying to advance. Try charging 500 yards across a muddy field, pockmarked with 10-foot deep, water-filled craters, dodging artillery shells and a wall of enemy bullets from the moment you step out of your trench. And you got 500 yards to go, and there's barbed wire everywhere. And so you can imagine what an advantage that gives to the defense. And it makes, these were things that military planners who'd spent their academy days studying Napoleon were just not prepared for. And we saw the effects of it right away. August 1914, right at the very beginning, just a couple weeks into the war, the French lost 27,000 soldiers killed in
Oh.
one day. Killed, in the month-long battle of which that day was a part, the Battle of the Frontiers, they lost 330,000 soldiers in 1 month. And so in the past, losing 27,000 soldiers in a single day, let alone 330,000 in a month, that meant the war was over. Like, it's just period. The war is over. If you fought that in, the 1700s or the 1500 BC, it doesn't matter. You lose that many people in a single day, that decisive, the war is over. And what that meant was even the people who did understand that technology had fundamentally transformed the nature of the war that they were walking into, even if in ways that they couldn't quite predict, even those folks could still kind of comfort themselves that with the idea that the increased level of violence the technology would make possible would necessarily lead to a short, decisive war, since no state could possibly absorb casualties like that at that kind of a rate and stand the war. And of course, that turned out not to be true. What they learned was that it wasn't just technology that had changed. The political and social and economic structure of society had transformed in ways that really threw out all of the old assumptions about how much a country could take without capitulating in a war. And so they were able to mobilize men and marshal resources in a way that allowed all of these countries to continue on and on and on, despite taking casualties that, quite frankly, nobody could have possibly even imagined before World War I.
Why, you brought up the forces argument, and I've read that Churchill's writings on World War I are fascinating. Why no peace deal? I struggle with this as well, Daryl, and I know you'll have an answer here, but obviously I know the Genghis Khans, just kill every woman, man, and child, and cat, and move on. I know those guys existed, but for the most part in world history, you fought a battle or battles, you took casualties, okay, eventually there are too many, a winner is decided, and then you just simply come to the table and you have a negotiation. Yes, the loser has to give up some territory here and pay some things there, but let's all agree that this whole thing's too costly. We're going to walk away. The Vikings struck deals with people all the time. It was just how it was always done. Why was there no peace deal for 4 years with millions of people dying? How's that possible?
Yeah, so, a lot of it has to do with the changing nature of states and economies and just society in general that I just mentioned. All of that added up to mean that the victory conditions of war had radically changed. It was simply not possible to achieve a battlefield victory that was so decisive that it was going to cause the enemy to break. Even the Germans, all the way up until really the last month or so of the war in 1918, they didn't feel like the war was over. They felt like they could continue on, and it was only the breaking of the home front that really brought that about. So think about like the Battle of the Somme. The British suffered nearly 60,000 casualties charging German lines on the very first day, and yet that battle raged for another 4.5 months. And the French and British suffered around 750,000 casualties throughout the course of that battle. So if the sides can take that kind of punishment and keep going, the Battle of the Somme was 1916, so there was plenty of war left at that point. If they can take that and keep going, what you're left with is a total war of attrition between whole societies, where the goal, because it's the only real way to win a conflict like this, is to bring about the collapse of the enemy society, its institutions and its economy, its demographics, make it simply impossible for that society to continue to carry on the war. And this was something very new, just because it had never been necessary to go that far in the past. And so, if we learn anything from the aftermath of World War I, it should probably be that the consequences of social collapse are very unpredictable. The Russian Empire, of course, collapsed in 1917, led to a civil war, killed another 10 million people after they'd just been through the First World War, and then it led to the establishment of a genocidal slave hunting empire that menaced the world throughout most of the 20th century. You know, in Germany as well. The revolutions in 1918 forced Germany to pull out of the war, as revolutionaries were taking advantage of that chaos to break off parts of Germany and form little new Soviet and socialist states, self-proclaimed. And that was an experience that profoundly affected the outlook of people like Adolf Hitler and those who supported him, and even ordinary Germans. You know, yeah, I'll leave it at that. I was going to bring up a modern point, but I'll leave it at that.
No, it was awesome, as always, my man. I don't want to take up too much more of your time, Daryl Cooper. You are the best, as always. He has the Martyr Made podcast. I'd never miss an episode. Go subscribe to it. Highly, highly recommend. All right, we'll be back. Let me encourage you with something, to do something, I guess I should say. Today, go pick up a book on World War I. Even, look, maybe you're not a reader, totally fine, no judgment here. Some people are not readers. Pick up the audiobook version of World War I. I bet you learned something from this special tonight, and I bet you're in the very least curious. There are so many incredible books out there. Go pick one up and learn about really the formation of the world you know today. So much of it started in World War I. Why is the banking capital of the world in New York and not London anymore? World War I. Just the stories are endless. Go pick one up. You won't be able to put it down if you get the right one. All right? I hope you enjoyed it. I did.